The Ukrainian counteroffensive started more than a month ago with probing attacks on Russia's strong defensive positions. Reports now suggest that the offensive has shifted up a gear. US officials are quoted anonymously saying the main counteroffensive is now underway on the southern front. Russia also claims increased Ukrainian activity. Moscow's propaganda is insisting again the attack has failed before it began. Moscow is also fighting the information war on another front. A few African leaders are attending a Russia-Africa summit in St Petersburg. And after Russia ended the Black Sea grain deal, Moscow is now offering a few 10,000 tons of grain to counter food insecurity in several friendly African countries.
The Russia-Africa summit is an opportunity for Moscow to tell the world it's not alone and it can still do political business. Consider all that has resulted from the invasion of Ukraine, internationally with an arrest warrant for President Vladimir Putin for war crimes, and internally with the instability of a failed mutiny by the leader of the Wagner private army. Despite all this, African heads of state fly in when Putin invites them. But why? The former Soviet Union was a pivotal partner to many African states in their fight against colonialism. It provided funding, moral support, and in some cases weapons to independence movements. For Moscow, it was an opportunity to counteract Western influence during the Cold War. Countries like South Africa, Zimbabwe, Angola, and Mozambique are still ruled by parties that were supported by the USSR during the liberation struggles. Some former heads of state even studied in Moscow. Some relationships continue to be cozy, especially with South Africa. Russia gave the liberation movement, the ANC, money, weapons and training for the fight against apartheid. The ANC is in government today and it seems has not forgotten. Russia invests very little in Africa. It accounts for only 1% of the foreign direct investment into the continent. And yet, Russia is a major force when it comes to arms. In recent years, Russia has been by far the biggest single exporter of arms to the African continent. It sells more than twice as much to Africa than the US does. These arms sales are seen as giving Russia significant political leverage to its customers. And then there's the mercenary group Wagner. It's active in Mali, Central African Republic, Libya and Sudan, propping up autocratic regimes in exchange for natural resources like gold. It is accused of operating with awful brutality, committing massacres and other human rights abuses. Wagner's founder, Yevgeny Prigozhin, threatened a rebellion against the Russian leadership at home, but Moscow says Wagner will continue its operations in Africa. Russia's withdrawal from the Black Sea grain deal has pushed up global food prices. This is expected to hit East Africa the hardest. Ethiopia and Somalia are already gripped by drought, conflict and hunger. Approximately 80% of East Africa's grain is imported from Russia and Ukraine. In Somalia, this figure is 90%. Russia's President Putin has said he wants to assure African countries that Russia is capable of replacing the Ukrainian grain. The main priority for African leaders in St. Petersburg will be getting enough grain to feed their people. If Moscow offers to replace what Ukraine can no longer supply, that will tighten ties even further.
Well, Russia's growing influence in Africa is most evident in the Central African Republic. The Wagner mercenary group effectively controls the capital, Bangui, and provides security for the president. The private army has been accused of carrying out massacres, which it denies. Russia's reach even extends into religion.
Regis Sinclair Voyemawa is the Russian Orthodox Church's man in the Central African Republic. He switched his Byzantine Orthodox Church to the Russian version last August. 5 months after Russia invaded Ukraine, that invasion has sharpened international concerns about Russian influence in countries like the Central African Republic, including via institutions like the church. Don't you also think that there is some form of huge Russian influence in the Central African Republic?
The Russians are correcting the mistakes that others have committed, like the French. Russia has never colonized an African country. It must be said that Russia is a great partner in terms of security, especially in our country. We're in the heart of Africa and are threatened by rebels and terrorists. Russia's here and we're at peace. We're happy to have our partnership with Russia.
Regis trained in the Russian Orthodox liturgy in Moscow. His church is sponsored by that church, and soon 2 Central African Republic seminarians will follow him to St Petersburg for study. It's thought a quarter of people in the Central African Republic's capital, Bangui, are members of the Russian Orthodox Church, converts from the Roman Catholic Church.
I don't feel influenced by the Russians because it is a church that teaches us the truth. And then the liturgical doctrine is good. There are several things that I did not master before. It is now that my eyes begin to open to know the truth and the right path.
Just as a Russian private army, the Wagner group protects President Faustin Archange Touadéra, a statue to its soldiers watches over the center of the capital city. People here in Bangui won't speak critically about Russia's influence or actions. Either they are too scared or they appreciate the relative quiet.
I know that there used to be a Roman Catholic church and that this church was transformed into a Russian Orthodox church. And with the presence of this Russian Orthodox church, we feel that there is a Russian influence in our country. If this influence can bring security, peace and development in our country, then this is what all Central Africans want.
In this country which has lived through decades of wars, this desire for a new beginning is widespread. For those who are not suffering, it matters less who runs security or the churches. Relative stability may be enough.
Big smiles, handshakes, warm words, and a hearty helping of pomp as African leaders touch down in St Petersburg. Moscow is on the lookout for allies, and this 2-day summit is a critical part of that push. During his speech, Vladimir Putin reminded leaders of Russia's importance as the world's largest exporter of wheat. He also took the chance to stir up some antagonism towards the West.
A paradoxical picture emerges. On the one hand, Western countries put obstacles in the way of deliveries of our grain and fertilizers, and on the other, frankly, they hypocritically accuse us of the current crisis in the world food market.
The summit follows Russia's withdrawal from the Black Sea Grain Initiative, a move which was heavily criticized for endangering global food security, and something alluded to by the chair of the African Union during his speech.
An agreement on grain supplies must be reached to save thousands of people who are dependent on these imports. Africa's economic food security will be most at risk, especially since the continent is already badly affected by food price shocks caused by the interruption of supplies.
If Assoumani hoped to have the whole continent covered, he may have found the Russian president's offer somewhat anticlimactic.
We will supply Burkina Faso, Zimbabwe, Mali, Somalia, the Central African Republic, and Eritrea with 25 to 50,000 tons of grain free of charge in the next 3 or 4 months. We will also provide free delivery of these products to consumers.
The applause echoed around the chamber, but internationally it was not quite so well received.
It is clear that when taking out of the market millions and millions of tons of grains, it is clear that, based on economic laws, that will lead to higher prices. So it's not with a handful of donations to some countries that we correct this dramatic impact.
So while Putin's grain giveaway is a drop in the ocean compared to previous numbers, Moscow will be hoping it has brought some diplomatic credibility when it is so desperately needed. But with far fewer African leaders actually attending the summit, Putin's critics will see this as further evidence that he is continuing to lose his global clout.
And joining me now is John Lechner. He's a journalist and researcher on the Russian Wagner Group activities across the African continent, and his book on Wagner will be published next year. First, let's start by asking, what does Russia get out of this offer?
Well, I think that what Russia gets out of it is an opportunity to show its goodwill to Africa, and specifically to, as we mentioned, 6 countries that Russia either has a very good working relationship with or is looking to court further.
Now, Putin promised free grain to 6 countries, 3 of which have a strong Wagner Group presence. What do you make of this?
I'm not sure that, well, they're tied, but indirectly, I think. Wagner is obviously there in the Central African Republic, has a company presence in Zimbabwe, and a disputed, unlikely presence currently in Burkina. So I think the relationship is a product of defense agreements, first and foremost, of which Wagner plays a part. And then those defense agreements play over into kind of a larger relationship between Russia and these specific countries.
Now, do you think this deal comes with any strings attached?
It's too early to tell at this point. Some of these countries, like the Central African Republic, already have such a good relationship that in a way it feels like just a continuation or show of goodwill for what the country has done in the past. But I think that being said, I wouldn't be surprised if there is a tacit understanding, at the very least, that along with this grain deal perhaps comes support at the United Nations from these countries or something similar.
Now, African Union Chair and the Comoros President Azali Assoumani has called on Ukraine and Russia to end their war. How much pressure can African leaders actually impose on Russia, you think?
I think at this point, African leaders probably have as much ability as any other major power or country to exert influence on ending the war, which is unfortunately not much. I think what's happening and what's interesting is that 2 things are true, as was mentioned in the segment previously. A lot of the grain that had come out of the initial grain deal was actually, the most part, was going to developed countries. And what affects Africa more than this distribution of grain, or even the distribution beforehand from Ukraine, is the effect that it has on international prices for African countries looking to buy food.
UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has warned that what he calls a handful of donations will not offset the cancellation of the deal. But President Putin says he can help Africa.
Our country is able to replace Ukrainian grain both commercially and in the form of gratuitous assistance to the neediest African countries. Moreover, this year we again expect a record harvest. But to be specific, I will say that we will be ready to provide grain free of charge in the next 3 or 4 months. Burkina Faso, Zimbabwe, Mali, Somalia, the Central African Republic, and Eritrea. 25,000 to 50,000 tons of grain each. We will also provide free delivery of these products to consumers.
It's quite an offer. So how does Russia benefit? Well, I asked Samuel Romani. He's an associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute defense think tank and author of Russia in Africa.
Well, I think it's a counterweight to the withdrawal from the Black Sea grain export deal, which was criticized by some African governments, including Egypt and Kenya. And it also will be paired with an initiative to directly transfer grain towards African countries. Turkey and Erdogan has alluded that he might even support that direct transfer of grain, provided that Russia rejoins the grain deal. So it's hard to make it operational, but Russia's planning these as alternatives.
Right. And does it come with any strings?
Well, the free grain, as you can see, is mostly dedicated towards countries that are Russia-friendly, right? Mostly authoritarian regimes that are largely isolated from the West. So I think it does come with some strings. It's telling that, that the Russians gave grain to Mali yesterday, and Mali, of course, is the center of Wagner Group influence. So it's very clear that having a security partnership with Russia and being friendly with Russia leads to you getting grain, and voting for Ukraine in the UNGA means you're probably not going to see grain coming.
Right, because this was an offer made only to 6 of the 17 countries in attendance.
Exactly, yeah, and it was out of the 17 countries that are in attendance, that suggests that there's a much smaller than the 43 that were in the last 2019 summit. So the vast majority of the continent is not going to be receiving supplies from Russia.
And so those countries that stayed away, what will have motivated? Are they making a point by staying away? Was this effectively a boycott? Because, as you say, the attendance this year much lower than last year, than 2019.
Well, I think it reflects, in some ways, the opinions of various member states towards the war in Ukraine. We look at the UNGA votes. You see major regional powers like Nigeria, vote against Russia repeatedly in those resolutions. Also, I think, as the Russians have pointed out, there may be some pressure coming from the West that's at play here as well.
Let's talk about Russia's Wagner mercenaries, which have been very active on the continent. How has that changed since they abandoned their mutiny in Russia?
Well, it doesn't seem as if there's really been much change in how the Wagner Group is actually conducting itself inside Africa. It seems as if they've kept their foundations of around 2,000 troops in Libya, in spite of a rumored strike on their installations there. They're holding up in Central African Republic and actually expanding the number of instructors to protect the President Ouattara from any kind of unrest ahead of his referendum on extending his term beyond 2025. And they're also holding up in Mali to the point at which the Malian junta is receiving sanctions from the United States, additional sanctions for its work with Wagner. And now they're trying to capitalize on the coup in Niger to try to step in there. So I think that Wagner is basically alive and well in Africa and continuing basically as it was before the mutiny.
So I'm slightly confused then as to how important Africa, this vast continent, is to Mr. Putin. He's going out of his way to make concessions to his supporters on the continent. But is this something that he's particularly bothered about? Is the continent something that he is concerned about?
I think it's something that's risen in importance quite significantly since 2014, the annexation of Crimea, which put Russia at odds with the West. So Russia naturally went to the collective non-West to look for additional partners. And Africa, of course, is the largest bloc of countries in the UNGA. So it's a means of showing that Russia's not isolated. Also, I think they're trying to pursue economic opportunities here. But Russia's trade with Africa is very small. It's really between the Netherlands and Belgium. $6 billion with sub-Saharan Africa, $400 million in investments. So, I mean, there's economic opportunities to be had, but Russia doesn't seem to be latching onto those very well.
OK, so it's not top of its list. Just a quick final word on the much vaunted African peace proposal. We heard so much about it a couple of months ago concerning Russia and Ukraine. Then it just seemed to disappear. What did, in fact, happen there?
Well, I think it just was really unworkable based on the expectations of the Russian and the Ukrainian sides. I mean, obviously, one of the ideas that was broached by the African peace proposal was a second referendum in Donbass, would allow potentially Donbass to be institutionalized as part of Russia. And that's something that Ukraine absolutely would not accept. And neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians want a ceasefire right now. The Ukrainians want to push for full liberation of their territory. And the Russians believe that in 2024, maybe Trump or DeSantis or a new president of the United States will scale back military assistance, and Russia can outlast the West and maybe make gains in the future. So I just think it was out of step with the current moment, and neither the Russians or Ukrainians wanted a ceasefire along the lines that the African proposal was representing and advancing. And that's the same problem that China, Indonesia, Turkey, and so many other countries have also faced when they try to push for peace proposals.
Good talking to you. Thank you for taking us through that. Samuel Romani from the Royal United Services Institute.